Right now, the international trade focus has been, of course, on the U.S. versus China. But our next guest just penned an op-ed that says, quote, "Forget about U.S.-China trade. The future is elsewhere." Adding that global trade between countries accounts for 58% of GDP, or approximately $45 trillion. That's globally. U.S.-China trade, he says, is only worth approximately $660 billion a year, just 1.4% of global trade by value. So let's bring in the guy who wrote that op-ed and find out why he says the U.S.-China trade war is not the game that should be played in town. Banyan Hill senior research analyst and economist Ted Bauman. The way I have been hearing it, everybody uses products and materials in their products and materials from China. You're saying no?
Well, thanks for having me on, Liz. I think, one of the key issues is that a lot of trade these days takes place between countries that are not the U.S. or China. And I think, increasingly what we're going to see going forward is that countries like African countries are going to be trading with countries in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, in Latin America, and they're going to be building supply chains amongst themselves. And really, if you look at the demographics of the situation, that's where the big growth in the long term has got to come from.
Right now,
because
let me just interrupt. Right now, we have Vietnam and Africa exchange-traded funds on the screen, and we're doing that because if people are looking for an investment angle as a business network, that's exactly what we're always trying to offer. What's that trade? But you need to make the case here for our viewers. You say that people are now, companies are doing business with African nations. What is the infrastructure like there? Because that's sort of been the lagging issue, and that China has leapt quite far ahead when it comes to development and industry.
Well, I think you're right. I think infrastructure is a major issue in Africa in particular, but that also presents an opportunity. I think in addition to the inherent demographic potential of a continent like Africa that's expected to essentially double in population by 2050, and where GDP per capita will probably treble over the same period, infrastructure is one of the kickstarters that pushes people into the global market. So I think the critical thing is to position yourself to take advantage of gains yet to come. And that's why I think the important thing is to understand how cheap assets are in the developing world right now. Those kinds of ETFs that you mentioned are at historical lows relative to U.S. equities.
Wayne Gretzky always says, go to where the hockey puck is going to be, not where it is. And you say the real drivers of change on your screen, agriculture, minerals. And I'm always thinking rare earths, because a lot of African nations have the rare earths, oil, electronics. There are obviously dozens and dozens of African nations. Which ones are most developed and the safest in which to do business, or at least place some bets? I often think of South Africa or Tanzania, but where else?
Well, I think right now, in fact, South Africa is probably one you'd want to give a little bit of space to because of political issues there. But certainly Kenya is positioning itself to be the economic and technological hub, not just for East Africa, but really for the Indian Ocean Basin. Very highly educated workforce, government that's very forward-looking in terms of the right conditions for business, and also just positioning itself as a hub for things like internet connections across the continent, travel, and so on. And also, they are the continental leader in e-payment systems, which is the most highly, Africa is the continent where the highest penetration of mobile phone-based banking in the world, and really led by Kenya.
It is fascinating, and I've studied a lot about mobile payments. They never had a storefront banks, so they had to go to mobile payments through their phones. Just fascinating. Ted, great to see you. Thank you. And we'll wait to see if Africa really plays out. I've been hearing for decades about this ever since I started doing business news and waiting for it to actually happen. But you say it's happening.
It's right on the cusp.
Ted Bauman, thank you very much.
Thanks.